So we didn't coordinate, and we didn't coordinate neither on this nor on the fact that the team ended on values and how to change people, and that's precisely what I'm going to talk about. So we just create coordination with the core. So this is what the students at UCL this year answered to the question we've been talking about, and indeed, inequality and climate change. I think this year, for the first time, climate change was the more common topic that they mentioned. So it really is a very important issue. But what I want to talk about is really on values. I'll talk about how to teach economic theory and microeconomics with the core project tomorrow in the workshop, but today I wanted to talk about something else. So the three kind of items has to do with, for example, we're going to go to data because that's what we do in the core first. And in particular, we're going to try to answer first the question where do economics and capitalism corrupt the mind of people? So that's the first one. We'll answer a qualified maybe, not clear, but there is something to that. And then we're going to say, well, given that at least there's a possibility that we may be harming people's, morals in some sense, and we're trying to show you that in fact we can teach economics differently, so perhaps that doesn't happen. And then I'll show you what are our attempts right now to find out what are the consequences of doing this. And I will end with a plea for this particular answer. Okay, so does capitalism corrupt individuals? Well, maybe not. So there is a kind of well-known paper now by Armin Falk and Rona Sheck. It's called Morals and Markets. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's worth pondering because what they do is pretty striking. So this is an experimental paper in which individuals are put into three potential treatments. One is called individual, one bilateral market, one multilateral market. In the individual treatment, you're told here are 10 pounds. You can either keep the 10 pounds, in which case a lab mouse who is supposed to die will die. But if you don't keep your 10 pounds and give it to us, we will use the 10 pounds to keep the mouse alive in kind of nice conditions for a while. So that's what is called the individual treatment. So the bilateral market treatment is one in which two individuals are told, there's 20 pounds in here. If you reach an agreement about how to divide the 20 pounds, then you get whatever you decide to divide the 20 pounds. And if, on the other hand, there's one of them who has the possibility to say, no, we're not going to make a deal, and then we use the money to save an animal. Okay? So that's the bilateral market. The multilateral market is a more complicated kind of double auction in which you do something very similar. So as you can see, the fraction of animals that die in the bilateral markets and multilateral markets is on the order of 75%, and it's the animals that die is only 45% in the individual treatment, which the authors say it's evidence that markets corrupt the mind because your moral judgment is impaired. Now, I think this is a bit extreme. There's another experiment by Kreider and Lowenstein, which tries to get at this in a slightly less flashy way, but also very interesting, in which they play in that case dictator games. Dictator games are games in which essentially decision problems, the individual has to decide some amount of money to give to someone else and yourself and another different distribution of money. So you have complete decision power on what you do. And what they find out is that when the person that has to make the giving decision knows that there might be someone else that can give money to the same person that you're giving, that creates a big difference in the proportion of donation. So if you are the only one that can give, so 72% of the people donate. In all the other cases in which it's either well-known or not well-known, with picture, without picture, it doesn't matter. To the extent that you're not responsible and someone else can donate, there's a lot less people donate. So I think there is an aspect of when we are together in a collectivity and you're making decisions, it may be that we maybe pay less attention to others. So not clear capitalism corrupt, but there is something in there. More closer to home, perhaps more interesting for us, does the teaching of economics corrupt the minds of individuals? And here, there's very many papers that have been written about this, and what's certainly clear from all of them is that economists are different. So people who study economics, and you ask them whether they donate or they provide contributions to public goods, all these kinds of things, economists do less of that. People who have studied economics do less of that. What's more controversial is whether the teaching of economics makes people donate less or contribute less to the public goods, or whether it is the fact that people who are less prone to contributing that are keener to study economics. So on the side of yes, teaching economics corrupts, there's this paper, there's more than this, but there's, for example, this paper by Núñez, Miranda, and Scavia, this is done with students at the University of Chile, and what they do to try to identify is look at individuals in the first year versus the fourth year, and they make them play a trust game, and they find out that the proportions of there's variation over time from first year to fourth year, but economists show a bigger drop in trust than individuals from other disciplines. So in that sense, teaching economics appears at least for these students to lower the amount of trust. There's a different study using very similar methodology by Freya Meyer that's done with students from Swiss universities, which finds something else. So for students in Swiss universities, economics students are less generous in general, and this is a donation to a charity. But it's not the case that the fact that they study economics makes less generous. Everyone becomes a bit less generous over time, but there's not a significant difference between economists and others. Either way, I think we have a problem. If what happens is that we attract less, collaborative people, that's already a problem. Why are we attracting these people? I think we should reflect on that. If, in addition to that, for at least some students, we kind of make them become less generous by the way that we teach, that's also a problem. So either way, we have a problem, and that's one of the things that I think the teaching in a different way might help us, either by presenting a different way of teaching that attracts maybe more collaborative people, or by not putting too much in the forefront of their mind the fact that people have to be extremely self-interested. So this is what the core does in that respect. Can we teach economics differently? Well, we can, and we do, and there are some of the things that we do. Wendy has already told you, but one thing we do to begin with is put data at the forefront of everything. And if you put data at the forefront of everything, then some of the dogmas that may be still in the mind of students, if they take naively the standard approach to introductory teaching, might change. So for example, already in the first week, we ask them as students, we need to think about some questions. So for example, does immigration increase unemployment? The standard answer would be, well, probably yes. If you do the standard economics teaching, we tell them, we need to look at the evidence. It's not clear that this always happens. And this is already in the first class. We'll explain to you why this might be the case, but be careful when you answer questions, and every time that you ask a question, check whether that's in fact true. Similarly with minimum wages, which is something that in many countries, certainly in Europe, but I'm sure also in Latin America, it's becoming a very important and controversial issue in the political arena. And we tell them, students, do minimum wages increase unemployment? If you follow the standard economics textbook, you will say, well, of course. And we're going to tell, well, maybe not. Data says not, and we'll try to explain why this might not be the case. And there, for example, it's, I think, clear in this case that in this case the way that we teach makes a difference, because we start teaching the labor market in a frictional labor market in which there is equilibrium unemployment, there is incentive issues, and we don't privilege necessarily perfect competition. Our markets are always imperfectly competitive to begin with. In those kinds of words, that's not so surprising. In fact, the people who have studied this in depth show that those are probably the mechanisms through which we observe that minimum wages don't necessarily increase unemployment. We also tell them, but that doesn't mean that everything that standard economics has to do is absolutely worthless. The other thing we do in the first day with these are the photos. We ask them to play the market game. Before we explain anything, we make them play the standard laboratory market game, and maybe we can talk about this tomorrow in the workshop. But essentially, that's a laboratory game in which you show that the standard demand-supply equilibrium paradigm is something that has value in the sense that it has predictive value. If you do have, which you don't always have, but if you do have a perfectly competitive market, the prediction of the standard textbook is correct in the sense that it reflects what the data says. Okay, so here is something else that you can do. When we start teaching decision theory, first teach decision theory, so we introduce indifference curves. The next thing we do is we teach them strategic interaction, that is games. When we start studying games, we tell them first what's the prisoner's dilemma, or games that are social dilemmas, and we tell them, well, the standard prediction says that you should do this, or you should do that. Now, that's not what happens in reality. If you make people play this in the lab, but even if you make these people play in real life, you observe that people contribute to public goods and to that kind of thing. How do we explain that? And then we use the tools that we just developed of indifference curves to do, well, let's try to think again about a prisoner's dilemma and think what happens if individuals indeed have the concerns of the utility of others as part of their preferences. And then we introduce preferences of individual, and this particular individual is Anil, but Anil has preferences over his own consumption, but also Bala's consumption. Then we say, well, if Anil only cares about his own utility, how are his indifference curves? And that's a wonderful tool to actually make them think, what does an indifference curve really means? And interestingly, many of them say, if they're completely selfish, their individual indifference curves have to be actually vertical lines. Which, by the way, it's interesting because if in a standard textbook they might not see vertical indifference curves anytime, or maybe not until they do the final exam and some complicated questions arises there. So they say, actually, you can have this kind of indifference curves, and it means something. And say, but if that's not the case, if Anil cares about the welfare of Bala, then you might have other kinds of indifference curves. And then you can use this apparatus to say, well, what used to be a dominant strategy to donate, you might have indifference not contribute. You might have indifference curves in which it is actually a dominant strategy to contribute. And in fact, there may be even not a dominant strategy. You may end up with a game that is a kind of coordination game. So it's a wonderful tool to, first of all, introduce different kinds of preferences, go back to the tools and show that the tools, which I think is a very important lesson, the tools that we introduce as economists can allow us to understand the world. Not understand the world in a specific way, but it's flexible enough to accommodate many ways to understand the world. And I think that's a pretty important lesson to teach them. We also go and tell them that it's not just that we can use the tools to understand the world, but also the same tools tell us how can we change the world. And just after studying decisions and games, the next thing we make them study is institutions. Design of institutions, design of mechanisms, and you can show that changing what we call the rules of the game change the way people behave. You can tell them that there's experimental evidence that says that in a voluntary contributions game, if people might start contributing a lot, but then as they see what others are doing and that some people are not contributing, you start contributing less. But if you stop the game and tell them now, you can contribute the same way as before, but everyone has the chance to pay a little bit of money to punish someone else. So this is a way to potentially enforce in an altruistic way, but you can still enforce contributions to public good. So that's an institution. So the availability of punishment is a social institution, exists in many societies. I don't know if you've ever tried to cross a street on a red light in Germany, and chances are that someone is going to tell you shouldn't do that. Typically, it's an elderly woman that tells you to do this. So, and that's totally altruistic. You might be a moron and kind of threaten that person and so on, but often you don't do it, and it tends to enforce the behavior. Okay, so we can do other things. We can use these tools that we've already show them of games in extensive form, and tell them what happens in a game in extensive form that's called the ultimatum game, in which people make a proposal and others say yes or no, and then show them, so that's the way to analyze the game. Then after you analyze the game, you tell them that what happens in reality, and then you use this to say there can be a model that explains how people behave. So you go from model to data, and a new model that allows you to explain the data that you just observed. Okay, so important I've already mentioned, but let me mention again since I don't have too much time. We study from the beginning in the labor markets models with involuntary unemployment, the labor discipline models, and we use the same tools for explaining that model that we used previously. So again, we go back using the same tools. We can explain a wide variety of phenomena that are not the usual ones that you study in the typical textbook. We can also go back to experiments and use experiments to show that financial markets need not be efficient, and in fact in the lab they are often not efficient, that you can have bubbles in markets which shouldn't have bubbles. So this is an experiment. You can play it in class. In fact, I recommend that you play the bubble experiment in class. So this is an experiment in which there is a financial asset that has a clear value. So it's an asset that yields every period 0 and 60 with equal probability, that lasts for 12 periods. There's no terminal value, no discounting. The expected value is 30 per period. And then it's obviously, there's no uncertainty here, so when t period remains, the value of the asset should be 30t. So that's the theoretical prediction. This is what actually happens in experiment after experiment after experiment. So it starts going up way beyond the theoretical price, and then of course towards the end it collapses. So you can see it, and people will see it, and then when you tell them bubbles can happen, it won't be a mystery to them. It's, you can explain why these things can happen. Okay, so finally, in the last 3 minutes and a half, and this is where I'm going to ask your help, we have done some attempt to find out what is the impact of the core on various things, and we've designed an instrument to try to measure this, in which we have a survey first, in which the students from both people, ideally, you would do it with a cohort that hasn't done core, and then the same cohort, once you start using core, the following cohort, to try to do some kind of diff in diff, and then use another control that never uses cohort. So it's not perfect, but unless someone wants, and I would be very happy if someone wants to do an RCT, I would be very, very happy to try it, but that's not very likely to happen. So we're trying to do a kind of diff in diff, and then we'll do a survey in which we'll ask standard questions of sociodemographics, but also what is the interest in the topic. That's very important if you want to attract different kinds of people. What kinds of things they studied in the high school, and what do they want to study. We want to see if we attract different kinds of people, not just the ones that want to go into the financial world, which is totally okay, but we might want to attract different kinds of people. We do also play some games and try to measure their social orientation in some other way, try to find out about their volunteering activities. We ask them on questions on social issues, and then a social preferences test. And then we try to find out as well if they learn something, so we do a very, very short economics MCQ with 7 questions. We try to avoid anything that has to do with memorization of concepts or routine computations, and then focus on more conceptual issues. So that's already prepared. We've tried it with a bunch of people from King's College, but we didn't find a good control. We tried to do it, so if anyone wants to participate in something like this, we would be very happy.